Well, I'm joined now by the Labour MP Ian Murray, Drew Henry from the SNP, and by the Lib Dem MP Christine Jardine. Good evening to all of you.
Hello.
Christine Jardine, first of all then, it does look like things are going to go as planned today.
Yes, hopefully, and I think it's important that we bear in mind that what's happening today is that Parliament is trying to ensure that parliamentary process is not used and abused by this Prime Minister in the way that it has been, and that we don't fall into the trap of having a general election which makes it impossible for us to stop a no-deal Brexit. But I think I'm quite confident now we can do that.
And Ian Murray, are you also convinced that this is not going to end up stuck in the Lords?
Well, the Lords, rather unusually, will be using a guillotine system that they don't often use, which means they will have to vote on this come 5 p.m. on Friday. And the numbers are certainly in the Lords to have this passed. It would also seem that, given the numbers in the Lords, there should be no amendments to the bill, so hopefully it won't need to come back to the Commons on Monday, but if it does, we should be able to deal with it rather quickly.
And Drew Henry, if it does, as we were hearing from David Porter, actually the end scenario is likely to be a general election, isn't it?
Well, it seems to be the way it's going, but it's very important that we get this legislation through and that we make sure there's no opportunity for Boris Johnson, who, let's face it, you can't trust an inch, doesn't use a mechanism to make sure that he gets a no deal by some other method. So we've got to make sure that we all work across parties to make sure that can't happen.
But if there's an election then, Christine Jardine, he could just repeal it, couldn't he?
I think the situation we're in, Drew's actually absolutely right. We have to work together to make sure that we are aware of every little trick that he's going to try. He's tried several already, and there is no trust in the government, which is pretty dire, actually, when you think about it. We have a government that not even their own benches can trust. So I think we will all be working together. We will be watching for every single little nuance, and we have every expert possible looking at how we ensure that we don't allow him, by some other method, to drive us off that economic cliff.
Is the big question here, though, not whether or not you can prevent a general election?
Well, that's something we have to do. Don't forget that any call for a general election is coming from the Prime Minister, and as Drew and Christine have already said, we can't trust him. No. So if the call's coming from him, we should be weary to begin with. And the Fixed Term Parliaments Act do mean that he needs 434 MPs, which I don't think he will get. But the key thing here is...
But if he comes back with it as just as legislation, it's a simple majority.
And the key thing here is, and this is really, really important, because we can't trust the Prime Minister and because they're using every single non-conventional rule at the moment, we have to make sure that any general election happens after the 31st of October, because any general election before that, or any shenanigans before that from the Prime Minister, risks a no deal. Now, this for me is above party politics. We're all opposition MPs, we all want a general election, we all want rid of this government, but the Prime Minister has to stew in his lies for the next 6 weeks. He needs to get to the 31st of October with that legislation in place to get the extension to the 31st of January. When the extension is in place, in writing, after the 31st of October, when it's fully implemented, that's when you go for a general election.
I think that's a really important point that Ian just made, that we are all... This is not about not wanting a general election. This is about not wanting no-deal Brexit, and ultimately the Liberal Democrats want to stay in the European Union, but it's about ensuring that we don't allow that to happen by default.
But Drew Henry, if he comes back just needing a simple majority to get a general election, it does look like he's going to get it, doesn't it?
Well, we're looking at working with other parties to see if we can come forward with an amendment that would put a date into that legislation, making it impossible to bend that to suit his will, to try and force through
would the amendment get enough support,
Brexit. Though? Well, like I say, we have to work across parties. This is a very high-risk situation that we're all in at the moment. There's a lot of different variables out there just now, but one thing is for sure, all of the opposition parties at the moment need to work very much closely together to make sure that we prevent Boris Johnson getting his way, because we all know that there is no good Brexit for Scotland, but ultimately a no-deal Brexit is absolutely catastrophic, not just for Scotland, but for the whole of the nations of the UK. Yeah.
But you all say you're working together, but actually at the moment the SNP do really seem quite keen on having a general election.
We're really keen to get out there and have a general election. Of course we are. We want this Tory government gone. We want to be able to go out and fight that battle on the doorsteps and say, look, this is a general election that we believe we can make significant gains.
So how careful are you actually going to be then about trying to avoid one in the meantime?
Well, look, the most important thing is we're absolutely determined to get to the point where he can't push through a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October, and that's absolutely what we're focused on just now. It's the biggest threat to all of us just now Now, party politics aside, we must get to that point where he cannot force through a no-deal Brexit.
Can I just make the point, though, that 31st of October is the key date.
Yes.
And if we're all agreed in stopping a no-deal Brexit, the only way you can guarantee that is to ensure a general election is either not happening or is not scheduled before the 31st of October. So I know Nicola Sturgeon's tweeted today that after this goes on the statute book that they would be pushing and perhaps even support this legislation. Now, I don't want to be party political about it because we are all trying to work together because no deal is the most important thing in the national interest. But if that is the case, we cannot fall into Boris Johnson's trap of having some kind of election before the 31st of October. Otherwise, we risk a no-deal Brexit by the back door, and that's the key thing here.
Well, we're still looking at all the different possibilities just now, but the one thing we will agree is that we've got to get to the point where he cannot possibly get to the 31st of October and push through a no-deal Brexit. On that, I think we can agree.
Well, actually, it has to be after the 31st of October, because if you look at the statute books, and when you have a general election, how long it takes to have a Queen's speech, and then the first legislation after that, even now, there's not enough time to have a general election and have no-deal Brexit stopped. So it has to be after the 31st. And if any political party tries to, make mileage out of that, we would all, I think, be very disappointed.
She's looking at you, Drew Henry.
I'm not. I'm just saying
I think I've been crystal clear here.
Okay, Ian Blackford and Nicola Sturgeon have both tweeted today they might go for this next week, and that wouldn't be right.
I think we've been crystal clear here that our absolute priority, is to avoid a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October and avoid Boris Johnson.
So no election before then?
No election before then.
Drew Henry, thank you very much, along with Christine Jardine and Ian Murray.